All right, I'll start with this little time chart. And the first thing I might point out is that I do know how to spell. The INKA spelling of Inca is now the preferred spelling among professional archaeologists, Peruvianists, among people from Peru, and particularly the people of the former Inca Empire, people speaking Quechua, the Inca language. That spelling INKA gives a pronunciation usually that's closest to what it is in the Quechua language. You might notice also on this little chart that there are a number of cultures that preceded the Incas. They're simply one of the last cultures prior to the arrival of Spanish. Now, give a few brief comments before we get into my three favorite sites. First, as I just mentioned, they're the latest or the last and clearly the greatest of a series of cultures in the Andean region. Humans have been occupying the Andean area of South America for at least 15,000 years. And there are at least 3,000 or 4,000 years of fairly sophisticated cultures in the Andean area. But again, the Incas are simply the last of those. They started out in the area of Cusco, in the valley of Cusco, around 1100 AD, literally at the end of, or the collapse of some previous cultures that we usually refer to as the Middle Horizon, the Wari and Tiwanaku. They began to conquer some of their neighboring peoples around 1300 AD, although the main part of the Inca Empire, as we think of it today, is only about 150 years old at the time of the Spanish arrival. Their greatest expansion took place under their eighth emperor, at least the ones that we know about, a man by the name of Pachacutic. Pachacutic is sometimes referred to as the Alexander the Great of the Andes. Somewhere around 1450 AD, he led a expansion northward and then to the south. They ended up just before the time of the arrival of the Spanish, extending from the modern Colombia-Ecuador border all the way to Chile, south of Santiago, Chile. They did include much of what is today Bolivia. They did include the northwestern part of Argentina. And finally, they began to have some contacts with the Spanish in the middle to late 1520s. We know that because somehow the Spanish introduced some European diseases, particularly smallpox, into the Inca Empire, and it was spreading very quickly at the time of the arrival of Francisco Pizarro around 1531, and he reached the Inca city of Cajamarca in November of 1532, captured the Inca emperor, and that was the end of the Inca Empire. The Inca archaeological sites have several notable characteristics, things that are in common for most of them. They did fantastic work carving stone, sometimes into square blocks, sometimes into irregular polygonal blocks, massive stone walls, sometimes with stones weighing 30 or 40 tons. They also modified bedrock in many places. They had great skill in altering nature, particularly terracing. They terraced hillsides to increase agricultural production, but in several places they rechanneled rivers, straightened out rivers. They did other things to modify the physical landscape. And they were fascinated by flowing water, particularly canals, fountains, and baths. And in the three sites that I'll be talking about, we'll see evidence of those flowing water things. They loved caves. They talked about the caves as access to the underworld, and some of their creation myths talk about the very first Incas somehow coming out of caves, emerging from caves. This is a National Geographic map of Peru, and if you're ever going to visit Peru, you probably start out in Lima, the capital city. It's where the major international airport is. The Inca capital city is to the southwest, to the southeast, at Cusco. And several of the sites that I'll be talking about today are in and around the Cusco area. Now, again, I'll be talking about my three favorite Inca sites that you've never heard of. My favorite Inca site, obviously, is Machu Picchu. Millions of people visited there in pre-COVID times every year. Other sites in what we call the Sacred Valley, like Ollantaytambo or Pisac, are visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year. I've given this lecture many times, particularly on the cruise ships, and I've run into a few people that have visited one or another of these sites. I've run into one or two people that have visited two of them. I've never run into anybody who's visited all three of them. And in fact, one of the ones, the last one we'll see, I've never run into anybody that has visited it. The first one I'm going to talk about, though, is a site called Tipon, which is located only about 13 miles from Cusco. It's in the next valley to the south, the Valley of Oropesa. When I say it's 13 miles, that's as the crow flies. In terms of travel time, it's probably about an hour, because the site is at an elevation of between 12 and 13,000 feet. Now, Cusco is at 11,000 feet, but what it means here is that you have to go from Cusco down to the next valley south of it, and then you have to climb into the hills to get to Tipon. The main part of the site is a series of terraces, stone-lined terraces that go for about a quarter of a mile up both sides of a steep valley. They've literally have terraced this valley. It was built by the father of Pachacútec, a man by the name of Viracocha, Inca Viracocha. It was his royal estate, and the suggestion is that the construction here started sometime after 1400 AD. Again, Pachacútec led the expansion of the empire around 1450, but this is his father's place of residence. And there's still a place above the main part of the site, the ceremonial plaza, that is still used by the local people today as a place for giving offerings, as we'll see at the end. Whenever I've flown out of Cusco, leaving Cusco, I always choose to sit on the left side of the airplane, and I try to get a seat not next to the wing so that I can look out the window. And if you do that and you know where to look, you can find this spot. You can spot Tipon. It's this series of terraces, 13 terraces running up and down this small valley. This is one picture I took out the window. Here's another shot, a little bit better one, again on another flight leaving, and that's Tipon, these series of terraces up and down this little valley. This is a Google Earth image of the site. There it is again, and here's a little bit closer view of Tipon from Google Earth. I found this one on the web, and incidentally, the pictures that you'll be seeing here are all ones that I've taken. A few cases where I've found one on the web that's better than something I had or shows a different angle, I will put down, like you see here, that shows that this is from the web. Now we're going to look at some shots down on the ground. And again, what you're seeing here are these 13 terraces that have been built to fill in this valley. This is from up above looking down. And again, these terraces. The way in which you get from one level to the next is by these projecting stones that literally make a staircase, although there are a few other staircases, regular staircases, and there are some wooden stairs that they've put in to allow tourists to safely navigate from one level to another. I want to focus in on a couple of buildings. You might see those structures there. There's two sets of structures on the one side of the valley. There's another set of structures that would be off to my right where I took this picture. And then again, there's a ceremonial plaza up above behind me. But we'll look at those structures a little bit closer. There's one, and there's a couple of other ones there too on the left, or a little bit closer view, or a closer view of those structures there. I want you to focus in now on the left hand of those. Watch that building right there. Incidentally, these pictures have been taken probably in 5 or 6 different visits. First time 1981 or 1980, I think, and then more recently up through earlier this decade or last decade. There's the same building. This is from, I think, 1982, this photograph. But look at that building there. And if I back this up, there's the same building. What's happened here is that this site has been reconstructed. Whenever you see an archaeological site, what you want to question is this the way it was before the archaeologists arrived? Has this been reconstructed? Has it been stabilized? Stabilizing would be to make it so that the things don't fall down as somebody visits the site. Or in the case here, they're reconstructing. They're taking rocks that had fallen down and literally rebuilding the buildings, hopefully as they were, but there's no proof that that's the way they were. There again, that's that building there, that's the same building. And when my first pictures from 1981, the walls were about 2 feet high. We do see a couple of typical characteristics of Inca structures. The stonework here is not among the best that you'll find, but notice the trapezoidal niches and windows in the buildings. Trapezoidal doorways, niches, windows are very typical of Inca construction. There's the same building up close, and you see the trapezoidal doorway, a little bit of it, and then the trapezoidal niches there. Let me back off here. The style of stonework here is called pirca, P-I-R-C-A, which is a very crude stonework. It's not the best that the Incas would have had. Probably this would have been plastered over, smoothed over, probably painted, but it's a typical of buildings that are not the very, very best. The best Inca stonework is what we call Cusco style or imperial style. And this is, you read in the books where you can't even get a knife blade between the rocks, where each rock has been carved to fit the ones adjacent to it. And here in a small fountain, we're seeing this, Cusco style or imperial style stonework. There's another view of the same little fountain. And there's another view of it. Again, this would be the better style of stonework. They could do it here at this site. There are canals that flow along each terrace. It would have watered the crops on each terrace. And what you're seeing here is what's called a drop structure. Water from one level is dropping down into the next. And at the bottom, there's a small pool. The force of the water is dissipated in that pool, and then the water would flow slowly, smoothly onto the terrace. Now, there is another set of canals here that are absolutely spectacular. And what we're seeing here is we're standing above the valley. We're looking down, so the terraces are below us on the upper right side there. And you see at the bottom of the screen 2 little water channels that are flowing into a spot, and then they're joining to make one, and then that one is bifurcating and making 4. And this is an absolutely spectacular little fountain. Again, it's the Cusco or imperial style stonework, absolutely magnificent. When archaeologists came to this site and were cleaning it out and beginning to reconstruct and stabilize and so forth, all they did here was to clean the water channel out. The water comes from 2 springs located above the site, about 1 kilometer, almost a mile away. And when they cleaned out that water channel, the water started to flow again without any problems. Just absolutely wonderful stonework and absolutely wonderful use of water. This is where the water is coming from. You can see the channel there coming down the hillside. There's 2 of these. This is one, and then there's one coming from the opposite direction, bringing water into the site. And there's a view from up above, and it's that very small little water channel that would have been carrying water down into the site. Now, on the hill above the site to the north of the main part of the site, there is a semi-subterranean small courtyard dug into the ground, and you see it up there in the Google Earth image, or here in this version of the Google Earth image. You see that little semi-subterranean courtyard. It again is done with the Cusco style or imperial style stonework. Very, very nicely done. Beautiful stonework. And there are a series of niches in the wall. They hadn't been cleaned out when I took this picture. In fact, I haven't been back up to this part of the site recently to know if they've actually finished this. But there were a series of those little trapezoidal niches built into the wall. And to the left of the niche on a projecting rock there, you might be able to see a little bowl. There's a close-up on it. And this was an offering that was done by some of the local people. They would have burned something in that small bowl, perhaps coca leaves, which are used ceremonially in Peru even today, perhaps tobacco, perhaps something like human hair or even fingernail clippings would have been put in here, some sort of offering. They also frequently will use alcoholic beverages. Here's a wine bottle, but the small bottles of alcohol would also be used as offerings here. So why do I like Tipon? Well, it's one of the absolute classic examples of the modification of nature, those terraces, the absolutely wonderful manipulation of water, bringing water almost a mile from two directions into the site to provide water for the baths and the fountains. And then it's still being used as a sacred place by the locals today. Second site I'm going to talk about is called Rachi. Rachi is located about 60 miles out of Cusco, south of Cusco, at an elevation a little bit above Cusco. Cusco's at 11, this is about 11.5. It was built at the foot of a small volcano, and the stone from that, andesite stone from the volcanic eruption, was used for building the buildings at the site. At Rachi, we'll see the largest Inca temple that was ever built. It's also the largest roof structure that was ever built by them. It was dedicated to one of their gods, Viracocha, their creator god. This is not the same guy that was the father of Pachacútec. That was an actual human, Inca Viracocha. This is the creator god. And the temple is about the same size as a US football field, about 100 yards or 300 feet long, roughly 85 feet wide. And at the peak of the roof, it's about 50 feet high. We're going to fly from Cusco over to Rachi. We'd have to take a helicopter because there are no flights or no airport here, but it's roughly 65 miles. That's about a 2-hour drive. Again, it's a twisty, turny road. It's now paved all the way, although when I first visited here in 1980, it was still a dirt road. Cusco there is at the top left. The only big town between Cusco and Lake Titicaca is a town called Sicuani, and that's at the bottom right. And Rachi is just a little ways out of Sicuani. This is a close-up view. That dark spot in the center is the Quismachata volcano, this little volcanic eruption that was at the site. The Urubamba River, which flows from the southeast to the northwest and actually flows near Cusco. It's not in the valley of Cusco, but just near. And Urubamba River is the one that is in the Sacred Valley. And then flowing farther north on the Urubamba River, we'd go past Machu Picchu. This is near the headwaters of the Urubamba. The site is in that little cove or alcove area there within the volcanic eruption, the lava flows of the Quismachata volcano. The volcano is kind of interesting. It's the northernmost outlier, the last little bit of volcanic activity from a zone of volcanoes that extends from southern Peru all the way to northern Chile. And within that volcanic axis, many of the volcanoes are still active today. It's a very active volcanic area. Geologists suggest that this was a very late little volcanic eruption. It started about 11,000 years ago, which was after humans began to be in the Andes. But the most recent eruption took place around 4550 before the current era, or if you think of it this way, before the time of Christ, roughly 6,500 years ago. And the volcanic eruption that we see today is about 20 meters thick and mainly comes from that eruption 6,500 years ago. There are some suggestions that some of the Inca origin myths refer to the Quismachata volcanic eruptions. If you think about it, roughly 1,000 years is about 30 generations. 6,000 some years would be about 180 generations. But it's conceivable that people might in this area still have had some reference or some knowledge of that last volcanic eruption. Clearly, it is a special spot because of that eruption. Here's a little bit closer view. Everything you see at the upper part, upper left, upper right, and to the right of this slide, or this image, is the lava flow from the volcanic eruption. Everything there in the center is the archaeological site and the modern town of Rachi. There is a modern church, and then there's the Inca temple. In this view, the modern church is there on the left, and the remains of the temple are there, that high wall that you see there kind of on the right. In this view, the Inca temple is on the left and the modern church is on the right. There's the wall. This is simply a wall that supported the center part of the roof. And it's about 50 feet high. Again, the temple itself was about 85 feet wide and about 300 feet long. That's the center wall of the church. Notice that the bottom part of the wall, up about 9 or 10 feet, is the good Cusco-style construction, the imperial-style stonework. Although the stone, it's an andesite from that volcanic eruption, is not as good as was used in many of the other Inca sites, but it still was done with the Cusco-style construction. The upper part of the wall is the adobe brick. There again is our polygonal masonry where each block is carved to fit the ones around it, and a trapezoidal window. There's our Inca temple. Notice the kind of layout of it. It has an outer wall, that center wall, and then you see a bunch of dots there right at the end of the arrow. There's one. There's 22 of those. Those represent columns, the bases of columns, 11 on each side of the central wall. Here I've turned the plan view to the right, twisted 90 degrees to fit the slide, fit the image. North is to the right. But you see the central wall, and then the outer wall, and then those 22 bases of columns. Notice also in this image, the doors are at the south end. There are lots of speculations as to how this temple operated. There are a few Spanish records that saw it just after the conquest. One man was actually traveling on an Inca highway that passes nearby and talked about this temple, but nobody at that early date gave any kind of suggestion as to how it really was functioning, other than it probably had some sort of an idol at one end, probably in this image on the right side or the north end. There are some suggestions that that idol is now in a museum in Madrid, stone idol, but we're not positive of that. We can't really say for that for sure. But some authors have speculated that you came in one of the doors there on the south end or the left side here, and then you worked your way through in a zigzag fashion, going through the doors through the central wall from one side to the other, back and forth, zigzagging until you reached the idol at the opposite end. Other authors have speculated that the two sides separated by the central wall might have been separating the sexes, females on one side, males on the other side. In several religions today in the world, there are separations in the religious structures between males and females. That's fairly common among some religions. We just don't know what was going on here. There again is our central wall. You can see the bases of some of the columns there. There's a figure there to give you a sense of scale. Again, the stonework at the bottom, the good Cusco style or imperial style stonework, reaches about 9 or 10 feet high. Here's an image I found on the web suggesting what it might have looked like. the columns supporting beams that would have helped to support the roof. Here again from the web. There's a picture of some young guy, actually 40 years ago, standing at the base of one of those columns, 1981 picture. And there's what have been the end view. See the columns helping to support the roof. There are several other things that are kind of interesting at the site of Rachi. You can see the temple there with the high wall. On the right-hand side, you can see the modern church, but in front of the modern church, in our side of the modern church, you see a little lake. And on this image here, there's the temple, there's the lake. It's actually something that the Incas dug out, and adjacent to the lake are a series of fountains. Here again, the lake is there in the foreground. Or in this little video, again, the lake is here in the foreground, the wall there, and then some other structures there in the background. The lake is today shallow. It's only about a foot deep. I've seen people go out there and wading in it. Sometimes it's a hot day, but that was built by the Incas. There are some fountains adjacent to the lake. Water from several springs on the volcanic on the volcano today feed into these springs or into the fountains. You may notice here that the stone is again that andesite from the volcano, from the volcanic eruption. It's fairly well carved, but it's a fairly soft stone, so it doesn't hold a nice polish, and it's not quite as well done as some of the other Inca sites, but it's still very nicely done. This is one of our two Peruvian goddaughters, Arlette, and in the upper left of this little map, we see the Temple of Viracocha, in Spanish, the Templo de Viracocha. The area there that's pointed to by the arrows is what I call the hotel zone. This is the Holiday Inn area. The temple would have had lots and lots of pilgrims coming to visit it. It's along an Inca highway. It's one of the main Inca highways in the highlands, and it would have been very easy for people to come here. All along the Inca road system, there were what we call tambos. Tambos were essentially guest houses or rest spots. And usually they consisted of only 4 or 5 buildings, maybe 6 buildings, a couple of them permanent occupied by the hotel keepers, so to speak, and then the other buildings used for people traveling along the road. At this site, the hotel zone or the tambo zone is much bigger because you would have had a lot more people coming and staying here as pilgrims. So there's our temple again, and this is the tambo area. You see a series of courtyards, and on each side of the courtyard are 2 buildings, and on the third side there are 2 buildings. The buildings on the sides of the courtyard are double buildings. They have a central wall, solid wall, doesn't have a doorway through it. So there are two rooms, one on each side of that central wall. Each room would have faced onto a courtyard. And you can see here that there are, 6 of these courtyards with a total of 36 buildings, or 7 courtyards, I think. There's one of the big buildings, or here, solid wall, no doorway through it, a series of trapezoidal niches in the walls. And these are on these courtyards of what I call the hotel zone or the tambo zone. There you can see the solid wall, the trapezoidal niches, and the wall would have helped to support the roof. This is one of the smaller buildings on the third side of the courtyard. That's our other Peruvian goddaughter, Natividad or Nadi. And behind that, you see some circular structures. The circular structures are interesting. It's what they're called the colcas. Colca is the Quechua word for storehouse. And there are over 150 of these circular storehouses at the Rachi site. Now, Rachi was a religious site. It would have also been a state site. That is to say, the political administration or the Inca emperor and his administration would have had things to do here. Taxes were collected for the religion and also for the state, and those taxes would have been placed into these storehouses. Now, when we talk about taxes in a non-monetary system, the Incas did not have any money. The only way you can pay taxes is with labor or the product of labor. So people paid their taxes by helping to build the terraces or helping to build the temples or whatever. They also paid their taxes by turning over completed textiles, ponchos, maybe sandals, maybe weapons, or various agricultural products, things like corn or potatoes or other things like that that could have been stored in these warehouses. Series here have been reconstructed. Again, this is not just stabilization, this is reconstruction where they're making them look like they may have looked in Inca times. Many of them have not been reconstructed. They've been cleaned up a little bit and stabilized, and others haven't been touched at all. But again, there's over 150 of these things. The stonework here is Pirca style, P-I-R-C-A, which is the typical common Inca form of construction rather than the fancy imperial style. They all had a small doorway, a narrow doorway, and usually 2 or 3 small windows. Otherwise, there were no way in and out. Just a small, narrow doorway. There is one that has been completely rebuilt with a thatched roof. This is very nice if you're at the site and a sudden rainstorm hits, which has happened to me there. You go running to try to get in here. And I've been in here when like 30 or 40 tourists all try to jam into one building. It's the same way at Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu, there are about 4 or 5 buildings, and there'd be 1,000 people at the site, and everybody tries to jam into them when it suddenly starts to rain. But that one has been totally reconstructed with the roof. Now, there are a couple different reasons why I like Rachi, and clearly the colcas and clearly the temple are important. There's another reason why we like Rachi, and that relates to this particular picture. Again, I've been to this site many times, probably a dozen times or more. When I used to lead the Smithsonian tours from Cusco to Lake Titicaca, we always stopped here. It was one of our highlights of that particular day's tour. And one time we were here. This was not on the Smithsonian Day. This is when Ananda and I were leading a private tour. We only think we had probably 6 or 7 people with us. And we arrived here and there was a huge crowd of people. We couldn't figure out what was going on. And I took this picture right in the Colca area, excuse me, the Tambo area, the hotel zone area. These people were getting ready for something. What it turned out to be is a big festival, dance festival, music festival. It was sponsored that year by one of the local beer companies. In other years, it's been sponsored by some of the local television stations or other beer companies. But on the terraces that make up part of the site, and there are a series of terraces here, there were literally thousands of people gathered to watch the dances and the show. We kind of thought this was a one-off event. Turns out, I've done checking since then, it's an annual festival. 2020 would have been the 52nd annual festival if it had taken place, but because of COVID, it didn't take place last year. But it's been an annual festival for the local region, the local province. People come in here from all over the local province and do their dances. So you can see people crowding on the terraces there or here. If you wanted, food was available. Things like guinea pig. I always do suggest if you're in a local festival like this, you don't eat the stuff that's being cooking there unless you want the revenge of the Incas to catch up on you. But there were some very big loudspeakers set up, those square or rectangular gray things there. Those were loudspeakers, and there was a stage set up there in the background. If you go on YouTube and simply type in Rachi Festival, you will find lots and lots of videos from previous of these festivals. Again, people had come in from all over the local province, from the different villages in their costumes. This is all very traditional. And usually when you're at some of the Inca sites like Machu Picchu or particularly Pisac or Ollantaytambo, there will be people in traditional costume that are posing for pictures, and they'll want $1 for having their picture taken. These people did not ask for any money to have their picture taken. This was a group here from the town of Ayaviri. Wonderful costumes with those feather headdresses. And there's the woman and with her little girl there. The only thing these people did insist on, they did ask for one thing, and that was they insisted that they have a picture taken with me in the picture. So that was what we had to do to pay it. Ananda took this picture rather than me. Okay, why do I like Rachi? Several different reasons. One, it's the biggest Inca temple. It has good examples of the modification of terraces, modification of nature. The terraces, the lakes, the canals, the fountains, all of that's there. The only thing we're missing is a good cave. It's associated with that historically active volcano. It has the colcas, which show us how the Inca state and the Inca religion collected their taxes. And it's still an important center for the locals. So all of those things together make Rachi one of my favorite sites. Now again, Tipon being close to Cusco and Rachi right on the main road from Cusco to Lake Titicaca, I have run into occasionally people that have visited one or another. One time I ran into somebody who had been to both of those places. Our third site that I'm going to talk to is called Waitara, and I have never run into anybody who has visited Waitara. Every time I've given this lecture on the cruise ships or wherever, I've asked, has anybody been to Waitara? I've never found anybody that's been there. It's located about 150 miles southeast of Lima, and it's about 50 miles up a river valley. The coast of Peru is a desert, and there are a series of small rivers that come out of the Andes, crossing the desert. They provide irrigation in the coastal plain. The town of Waitara is about 8,000 feet up in the mountains. That 50-mile drive up the valley, it's paved now today all the way up to Waitara. Didn't used to be, but it's about a 2-hour drive because it's a twisty, turny road. I shouldn't mention this, but I will. The last time I was here 4 years ago, Tess was with me, and Tess gets car sick. There are two main Inca highways in the Andes. One runs along the coast, the desert coast. One is on the Andes Mountains, all the way from Ecuador down to central Chile. Then there are a series of connector roads that connected the Highland Road with the coastal road. Waitara is located on one of those small connector roads that runs quite close to the site. There are some pre-Inca remains. The area was occupied in pre-Inca times. The only significant structure at the site today is a large Inca temple. There is another Inca site about 12 miles further east along that same Inca road, but some significance. But what we're here looking at is the Inca temple. And very early in the colonial period, I think probably by the 1550s or 1560s, Spanish priests were operating here, and a church dedicated to San Juan Baptista was literally built on top of the Inca temple. So we're going to fly from Lima to Waitara. Again, we'd have to take a helicopter because there's no airport at Waitara, but we'd be flying down along the coast. We'd cross a series of small river valleys. Incidentally, all the way now, it's a 4-lane divided highway, toll road. We'd go past the towns of Canete and Chincha. We'd go to the town of Pisco, which would be just down there in the bottom left. And then we'd have to go up the valley to Waitara. And our helicopter would land us right there. I've given this lecture many times on the cruise ships. And the last time I gave it was March of last year as we approached Peru. In fact, we were supposed to be docking at the port of San Martin on the day after I gave this lecture, the last time I gave this lecture. And we were going to be visiting the area. There's the Pisco River Valley, and there is an Inca site not very far up the Pisco River Valley called Tambo, Colorado. And I was actually scheduled to help guide a tour to Tambo, Colorado. Unfortunately, the morning that we were to land at Port of San Martin, the captain announced that Peru had just closed its ports, and we turned around and headed back towards Chile. We sailed for a day south towards Chile when the captain announced that Chile had just closed its ports, and we ended up sailing back north to go through the Panama Canal to Miami on the end of that particular voyage. But Waitara is there at the right-hand side, again, about 50 miles up the Pisco River Valley. This is a Google Earth image of the town of Waitara, and the thing that we're here to look at is a church. The church is right at the edge of a cliff. The dark shading where the word church is located on this image, that's a steep hillside aiming down or going down. And we're going to be looking at that particular church. First time I was here was in 1981, and this is the view of the town. And there's the view in 1981 of the church. Notice that it was with 2 bell towers, although by 81 there was only 1 bell tower. Here's a 2007 picture of the church, and notice in 2007 it has 2 bell towers. Here's a view from just at the edge of the cliff going down. You can see the church is just about at the edge of this cliff. There again, a little closer Google Earth image. There's the church, has a large patio to the side of it. And this is a view from a hill looking down on that patio and the side view of the church. The wall of the church facing that patio is one of the most magnificent Inca constructions, this imperial style, Cusco style stonework. Beautifully done, very hard stone here. It's a series of 8 or perhaps even 9 trapezoidal doorways. Each doorway is double inset. They aren't actually doors, they lead into a niche. There are also niches there in the wall. Some of those are actually windows, some of those are actually just niches. The niches may have held some sort of offering, we don't really know. When I said there are 8, there's clearly 8, we see 8. There may have been a 9th covered up by one of the bell towers. There's a little closer view. And again, this is the absolute wonderful, wonderful Inca classic Cusco style, imperial style stonework, just beautifully done. I took that picture from the web. This is one of my pictures. This picture is a 500 millimeter telephoto shot from down the valley looking back at the church. You can see the steep hillside that it's just at the edge of. Again, this one is taken from an adjacent little hill looking down on it. And you may be able to see that there's a difference in the gable end of the church, or the church, or the structure, in the adobe bricks. If you look inside those yellow lines, that is the old Inca construction, the Inca gable end. And then outside those lines, or here on the wall to the left, is Spanish construction. Or in this image, inside the yellow lines is the Inca construction, That's the Inca gable end. And then above that, on the side and above the gable, Inca gable at the end, is Spanish adobe bricks. So the Spanish simply built a higher roofed structure, slightly less steeply sloped roof. The Spanish knew how to do a truss roof. The Incas did not. So the Spanish were able to do a slightly different style of roof. But you're also seeing these inset trapezoidal doorways here on the end of the structure. There was a canal or little channel that brought water into the site, into that patio, and it's not functioning today, but this was a fountain that's there. Let's go inside. This is a little video I took 4 years ago when I was there with Tess. There's a school next door, so what you're hearing are the kids in the school. But let's go inside. We'll just pan around and get a view here. And this is a view from the back of the church. There's the altar area. And you may have noticed in the video that the niches here seem to be trapezoidal, but when you look at them closely, they're actually kind of angled in as a kind of a triangle. We don't know what the Incas put in the niches. People suggest that perhaps offerings, many of the larger niches may have actually held things like mummy bundles, wrapped up bodies, mummies. We can guess, though, what they may have put in there, some religious thing, because we know that in this colonial Spanish church, what they put in were the images of saints. One of the other things you might notice, particularly if you see these from different years, this is a 2007 picture, the various saint figures are dressed every year. Somebody will take on the task of dressing a particular saint, and they'll make a costume and dress the saint. So there's the same image of Christ in 2 different years, 2 different costumes, or here of this saint in 2007, and a different costume 10 years later. One of the more interesting things is that there's this image that is not an old saint, even though he has the halo around his head. This was a figure done of a beloved priest in this church from the 1970s up to around 2000 or so. And frankly, I forget what his name was, but he was beloved, he died, and so they made a statue of him to stick in one of the niches. Now, why do I like Huaytará? It's absolutely one of the most fantastic examples of that Inca construction, the fine Cusco style, imperial style construction. It's in the hinterland, well away from Cusco on a minor road connecting the highlands to the coast. It's absolutely one of the best examples that we'll ever see of the imperial Cusco style stonework. And yet it also shows us the transformation of an Inca religious structure into the Christian church. We are going to do some other Zoom lectures. Our next one is going to be 4 weeks from today, Monday, March 1st. Dr. Tate Paulette, a professor at North Carolina State University, is going to be giving a lecture where the beer flowed like wine, beer and brewing in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. Will be sponsored by the Archaeological Institute of America. We also have another lecture the following month, April, the first Monday in April. A professor, actually not a professor, but a curator from the Harvard Art Museum is going to be talking about some art in Mesopotamia.